Your hips are at 90 degrees right now. They've been at 90 degrees for most of the waking hours you've been up today, and for most of the waking hours you were up yesterday and the day before, sitting at breakfast, sitting in the car, sitting at the table, sitting at dinner, sitting watching this. This position has a cost, and the cost isn't measured in discomfort. It's measured in tissue that has remodeled around the joint, in joint surfaces that have stopped receiving nutrition, in muscle capacity that has been silently eliminated over 50 years of the same posture. In Okinawa, home to the longest living population on Earth, people eat dinner sitting on tatami mats on the floor. In Sardinia, home to the second longest living population, they sit on low wooden stools and stone benches. In the villages of Ikaria, Greece, the elderly sit in low chairs or on the floor to tend their gardens. In Nicoya, Costa Rica, centenarians sit in hammocks and on low platforms. In Loma Linda, California, the Seventh-day Adventist community, which surpasses all surrounding populations in longevity, gathers in homes and gardens on low seats and cushions on the floor. Dan Buettner, who studied these 5 blue zone populations for National Geographic, documented a pattern that no one in the medical establishment took seriously. The longest living populations on Earth don't sit in chairs. They sit on or near the floor and get up from the floor dozens of times a day throughout their lives. The piece of furniture your body is sitting on right now is absent in all the cultures that produce the highest number of centenarians. This may be a coincidence. Biomechanics suggests it isn't. And the mechanism is specific. There is a test scored from 0 to 10, which requires nothing more than a floor, and which predicted all-cause mortality more accurately than blood pressure in a study of 2,000 adults. There is a mechanism of joint nutrition that depends entirely on mechanical loading through the range of motion, and that sitting in a chair restricts to a single surface. And there is a reason why a 3-year-old can hold a deep squat position for 10 minutes while a 65-year-old cannot. And the reason is not aging. It's mobility. Start with the mortality data, because the numbers are hard to ignore. In 2012, Claudio Gil Araujo, the same researcher whose 10-second one-legged balance test measured the speed of neurological integration in a previous episode, published a study at the Exercise Medicine Clinic in Rio de Janeiro measuring something different. Not how quickly 4 sensory systems communicate, but whether the musculoskeletal system can still produce strength, flexibility, and coordination in its full range. 2,002 adults aged between 51 and 80 years were asked to sit on the floor from a standing position and to stand back up without using their hands, knees, or any external support. Each movement was scored from 0 to 5. 5 points for sitting without support, 5 for standing without support, up to a maximum of 10 points. Each time a participant used a hand, knee, or side of the leg for support, 1 point was deducted. Each sway or loss of balance cost half a point. The scoring was biomechanical, not subjective. Each deduction corresponded to a specific compensatory movement the body was using to replace a capacity it no longer possessed. A hand on the ground during the descent means the hip extensors cannot control the lowering through the full range of motion. A knee touching the ground means the quadriceps cannot generate enough eccentric force to manage the deceleration. A sway means the cerebellar proprioceptive circuit cannot maintain balance during the transition. Each deduction is a specific system reporting its degradation through a compensatory movement that the person may not even realize they are making. The test doesn't ask which system is failing. It reads the failure in the movement itself. The group was followed for a median of 6.3 years. Participants who scored in the lowest category, from 0 to 3 points, had an all-cause mortality rate 5 to 6 times higher than those who scored from 8 to 10. After adjusting for age, sex, and body mass index, each 1-point increase in the composite score was associated with a 21% reduction in mortality risk. Getting up from the floor without assistance predicted whether you would be alive in 6 years with more accuracy than your blood pressure. Think about that. a test that requires no equipment, no blood draws, no imaging, no doctor, just a floor and 10 seconds of movement. It predicted death from all causes with a statistical power that most clinical diagnoses can't achieve. The question is what the floor is testing that the clinic isn't. And the answer begins with what the chair has eliminated, because a chair is not a neutral resting position. It's a specific biomechanical environment to which the body adapts over decades, and that adaptation has invisible costs until they are measured. A standard chair positions the hips and knees at approximately 90 degrees of flexion. The ankle remains close to a neutral position. The spine is supported by the backrest or remains unsupported at approximately a 90-degree hip trunk angle. This is a position, a musculoskeletal system configuration maintained for hours, repeated daily for decades. Sitting on the floor requires the body to adopt multiple configurations. Sitting cross-legged uses 90 to 120 degrees of hip flexion with external rotation and abduction. Kneeling uses maximum knee flexion, approximately 150 degrees. Squatting uses deep hip and knee flexion simultaneously with ankle dorsiflexion. Sitting sideways uses asymmetrical hip rotation. Each position engages different articular surfaces, stretches different muscle groups, and activates different stabilizing chains. Sitting on the floor exposes the hip joint to approximately 30 distinct positional configurations that sitting in a chair completely eliminates, a difference documented by biomechanics expert Katie Bowman over 2 decades of research into movement variability. 30 configurations versus 1. The difference is not one of preference. It is mechanical input to every tissue in the hip complex, cartilage, capsule, ligament, muscle, and tendon, over a lifetime. The hip joint of a wheelchair-bound person experiences the mechanical equivalent of eating a single food at every meal. The upper weight-bearing surface is continuously loaded. The posterior capsule stiffens from never being stretched. The external rotators shorten from never being asked to rotate. The ankle dorsiflexors become stiff from never exceeding the neutral position. Each tissue adapts to the single position it's given. An adaptation is the loss of the ability to assume any other position. The body doesn't lose range of motion due to aging. It loses range of motion due to not using its range of motion. The chair provides the most restricted range of motion input of any seated posture available to the human skeleton. The body adapts accordingly. Now, what happens to tissues that receive only one configuration for 50 years? Because the hip flexor problem is where most of the damage accumulates, and the mechanism is specific. The iliopsoas, the main hip flexor, originates from the lumbar vertebrae and the iliac fossa and inserts into the lesser trochanter of the femur. In a seated position, the iliopsoas is in a shortened state. Sustained shortening over months and years produces adaptive shortening. The muscle and associated fascia remodel to the shorter length through a measurable process at the cellular level. Sarcomeres are removed in series, reducing the resting length of the muscle, and the connective tissue matrix remodels around the new, shorter configuration. When a person stands up, the shortened iliopsoas pulls the lumbar spine into increased lordosis, an anterior pelvic tilt that changes the mechanical loading of each structure in the lumbar region. The lumbar facet joints are compressed. The intervertebral discs experience asymmetrical loading, greater compression posteriorly, greater tension anteriorly. The erector spinae muscles work harder to maintain an upright posture against the pull of the shortened hip flexors. Lower back pain, which millions of people attribute to aging, disc degeneration, or genetics, has a significant fraction originating from the adaptive shortening of the iliopsoas muscle due to decades of sitting in chairs. The muscle shortened because the chair kept it short. The spine compensated for the shortened muscle. The compensation produced pain. The pain produced inactivity. The inactivity produced more shortening. The cycle is biomechanical, not mysterious, and begins with the 90-degree angle of the hip imposed by the chair. The medical response typically addresses the pain rather than the shortened muscle that produced it. The therapy treats the consequence, while the chair recreates the cause 8 hours later. A species that evolved to squat, kneel, and sit cross-legged over 2 million years adopted a piece of furniture 5,000 years ago that keeps its main hip flexor in a shortened position for 8 to 12 hours a day. The muscle remodeled, the spine compensated, and the medical system treats the resulting pain as a disease of aging rather than a consequence of the furniture. Now, what was the skeleton really built to do? Because the deep squat isn't an exercise. It's a resting position that every human body was designed for, and which populations that use chairs have lost through disuse, not aging. A deep squat, heels on the ground, hips below the knees, spine relatively straight, is a resting position for every young child on Earth. Observe a 2-year-old picking something up from the floor. They don't bend at the waist. They drop into a full-depth squat, heels on the ground, neutral spine, and rest there comfortably without effort for as long as the task requires. Every healthy human skeleton accommodates this position. The hip joints, the knee joints, the ankle joints, the curvatures of the spine, all of them evolved to allow a full-depth squat as a primary resting posture. The child is not performing an exercise. They are using the resting position for which their skeleton was designed. Adults in cultures without chairs use this position for rest, work, waiting, cooking, and socializing. It's the norm. The chair is the aberration. The deep squat is what the human skeleton expects to do when it's not standing or lying down. The loss of deep squatting ability in populations that use chairs is not genetic. It is adaptive. The tissues that allow deep squatting, the ankle dorsiflexors, the hip external rotators, the deep hip flexors, the knee flexors, shorten and stiffen when they are never taken through their full range of motion. The joint capsules stiffen. The motor patterns for entering and exiting the squat are pruned from the motor cortex through disuse. The neural pathways that coordinated the movement in childhood are deprioritized when the movement ceases to occur. Research published in the Journal of Physiological Anthropology documented that populations with a lifetime habit of sitting on the floor maintain the ability to perform deep squats until the age of 80. Full depth, heels on the floor, sustained without discomfort. Populations that use chairs lose this ability as early as 40 years old. The skeleton does not change between these populations. The soft tissues around it adapt to the range of motion they are required to use. One population demands 120 degrees of hip flexion with external rotation dozens of times a day. The other demands 90 degrees in a single plane held statically for hours. The body has been built around the mobile it has been given. A 3-year-old child can perform a deep squat because every tissue in their body has moved through that range of motion since they learned to stand. A 65-year-old person who has sat in chairs for 50 years cannot perform a deep squat because every tissue in their body has remodeled around the 90-degree chair position. The skeleton is identical. The soft tissue envelope is different. The difference is 50 years of positional input. The person who stopped sitting on the floor at age 15, who chose the sofa, the office chair, the car seat, the restaurant counter, the airplane seat, the movie theater chair, the waiting room chair, removed from their daily life for 50 years. The positional variety that their hip, knee, ankle, and spinal segments needed to maintain their full range of motion. They didn't make a conscious decision to lose their deep squat. They made a series of furniture choices that accumulated over decades and produced the same result. The chair is not a resting position. It's a mold. The body has conformed to it. And here's why the act of standing matters more than the act of sitting, because that's where the mortality data is concentrated. The predictive power of the sit-to-stand test isn't primarily in the sitting, it's in the standing. Standing up from the floor without support requires a specific sequence of coordinated actions, shifting the center of mass over the base of support, generating concentric force through the hip extensors and knee extensors from a deep flexion position. Maintaining balance during a transition phase where the base of support is narrow and the center of mass is high, and controlling deceleration as the body reaches a full standing position. This sequence engages the gluteus maximus through its full range of motion, a muscle that is barely activated during chair to standing transitions because the initial 90-degree angle bypasses its peak force production angle. The gluteus maximus is the largest muscle in the human body, the primary hip extensor, and the muscle most responsible for generating the force needed to stand up from a deep position. Its peak force production occurs in deep hip flexion, angles below 90 degrees, precisely the range of motion that a chair eliminates. Standing up from a chair uses the quadriceps in a modest range of motion. Standing up from the floor requires the gluteus maximus to operate at its full range of motion. The consequence of decades without deep-range gluteal activation is gluteal amnesia, a clinical term for a gluteus maximus that has been neurologically downregulated by chronic disuse. The motor cortex reduces the excitatory signal to a muscle that is not being solicited to produce force at its peak range. The muscle atrophies selectively in the deep flexion fiber lengths. The hip extensors, which should be the primary mover for lifting off the floor, become secondary to compensatory patterns. The hand to knee, the forward lunge, the momentum-based impulse the body develops when the glutes can't do the work. The transition requires balance on a single leg during the phase when one leg is planted and the other is repositioning. It demands ankle dorsiflexion range of motion that sitting in chairs eliminates. It tests proprioceptive integration under load. The proprioceptors of the foot, ankle, knee, and hip must provide continuous positional data to the cerebellum as the body moves through an unstable transitional posture. Each transition from floor to standing position is a microtest of the systems that the mortality study measured: strength through range of motion, joint flexibility, balance under load, and motor coordination in multiple joints simultaneously. People in cultures that sit on the floor perform this transition dozens of times a day, rising from meals, conversations, rest, work. Each transition is a training stimulus. Each stimulus maintains the capacity that the test measures. Populations that use wheelchairs perform this transition approximately 0 times per day. The test that predicts mortality measures a capacity trained entirely on the floor and entirely eliminated by the wheelchair. The cumulative difference over a lifetime is categorical, not incremental. A person in a culture of sitting on the floor reaches 80 years of age having performed the floor to standing movement pattern thousands of times a year for decades. Each repetition loads the gluteus maximus through full range of motion, requiring balance on a single leg during the transition phase, cycling the hip and ankle through deep flexion, demanding proprioceptive integration under load. A person in a culture of sitting in chairs reaches 80 years of age having almost never performed that movement. The chair not only reduced the stimulus, it eliminated it. This pattern, longer living populations maintaining a capacity for movement that mortality data identifies as the strongest predictor of survival due to nothing more than the absence of a piece of furniture, is the finding that made research on sitting on the floor appear different to me. The correlation does not isolate sitting on the floor from dozens of other factors in the blue zones: diet, social integration, purpose, moderate activity, plant-rich diet. Biomechanics cannot claim that sitting on the floor is the reason why these populations outlive all others. What biomechanics can claim is specific. The mechanism by which sitting on the floor maintains musculoskeletal function is established. The association of mortality with the capacity it maintains is replicated. And each blue zone population shares this variable along with all the others. Now, the physics of why the joint itself needs movement, because cartilage nutrition depends on mechanical loading in a way that most people have never been told. Articular cartilage, the smooth, tough tissue that covers the ends of bones within joints, has no blood supply. None. Unlike muscle, unlike bone, unlike virtually any other tissue in the body, cartilage cannot receive nutrients from the bloodstream because no blood vessels penetrate it. It receives its nutrients by diffusion from the synovial fluid, the viscous fluid that fills the joint cavity. Diffusion is not passive. It is driven by mechanical loading and unloading. When the joint is compressed, fluid is squeezed out of the cartilage matrix like water from a sponge. When the compression is released, the fluid is drawn back in, carrying oxygen, glucose, and the molecular building blocks that chondrocytes need to maintain the cartilage structure. This is imbibition, a pump driven by movement, not by the heartbeat, and it is the only mechanism by which cartilage remains alive. The cycle requires variation. Compression must alternate with release. Loading must shift from one surface to another. A joint continuously compressed in one position does not cycle fluid. It squeezes it and keeps it squeezed. A joint continuously unloaded does not draw fluid in. No compression means no imbibition. Cartilage needs cyclical, intermittent, and varied loading to survive. The deep squat engages different surfaces than the cross-legged sit. The cross-legged sit engages different surfaces than the kneeling position. Each transition between positions is a pumping cycle, compressing one region and releasing another, driving nutrients to surfaces that the previous position deprived. Cartilage that is not cyclically loaded does not receive adequate nutrition. The surface degrades. Chondrocyte metabolism declines without mechanical stimulation. Osteoarthritis begins not from overuse, but from underuse of specific articular surfaces. The hip joint, when seated in a chair at 90 degrees, continuously loads the weight-bearing superior surface of the acetabulum and femoral head, while the posterior, anterior, and inferior surfaces receive minimal loading. The cartilage on the loaded surfaces is compressed without adequate unloading cycles, continuously squeezed without the release phase that draws nutrients back. The cartilage on the unloaded surfaces is deprived of nutrient exchange entirely. No compression means no imbibition, means no nutrition. The hip joint, moving through its full range of motion, sitting on the floor, cross-legged, kneeling, squatting, and sideways, distributes compressive loading across the entire articular surface, cycling fluid through each cartilage region with each positional change. Sitting cross-legged loads the inferior-posterior surface of the femoral head. Kneeling loads the posterior surface in full flexion. Squatting deeply loads the superior-anterior surface under combined flexion and compression. Each position feeds a different cartilage region. The joint is fed by movement through the range of motion. The chair restricts the feed to one surface. Osteoarthritis that develops on neglected surfaces is not wear and tear. The phrase itself is misleading, implying that movement causes the damage. The damage comes from the absence of movement. Cartilage that is cyclically loaded in varying positions maintains its matrix, maintains chondrocyte metabolism, and maintains its thickness. Cartilage that is statically loaded in one position or not loaded at all degrades due to nutrient deprivation. The hip replacement that a 70-year-old person receives is replacing a joint surface that has been deprived of nutrition, not worn down. The physics of the degradation is specific and mechanical. The question is whether it reverses. And the adaptive shortening that sitting in chairs produces is reversible within the limits established by age and the severity of the adaptation, but reversible nonetheless. The direction of remodeling depends on the signal the tissue receives. Soft tissue remodels in both directions. Muscles lengthen when held at greater lengths over time. Sarcomeres are added in series, the reverse of the shortening process that sitting in chairs produced. Joint capsules stretch when moved through increased amplitude. The collagen matrix remodels over weeks and months in response to the mechanical signal of sustained stretching. The motor patterns for deep squats and floor transitions can be relearned. The motor cortex retains plasticity for fundamental movement patterns throughout life because these patterns were never genetically lost. They were suppressed experientially. The neural architecture for squatting is still present. It was deprioritized by decades of non-use, not deleted. The first few weeks of sitting on the floor in a body adapted to chairs are uncomfortable, not because the floor is harmful, but because the tissues are being asked to assume positions they haven't assumed in decades. The external rotators of the hip protest against sitting cross-legged. The ankles resist dorsiflexion. The knees ache in deep flexion. This discomfort is the tissues receiving a mechanical signal they stopped receiving. The signal that tells them to stretch, remodel, restore the range of motion they lost. The discomfort is the adaptation beginning, not failing. The process is slow, weeks to months for measurable gains in flexibility, months to years for full restoration of motor patterns in a body adapted to chairs for decades. But the direction is consistent. Every study of progressively sitting on the floor in older adults shows measurable improvements in hip range of motion, ankle dorsiflexion, and the ability to transition from floor to standing. The tissues respond to the signal. They always have. The chair simply stopped providing it. Studies of progressive sitting on the floor in older adults follow a consistent pattern. Participants begin with cushion support, reducing the demand for hip flexion while still requiring trunk stability without back support. As tissues adapt over weeks, the cushion height is decreased. Transitions from floor to standing position begin with external support nearby, a chair or table within reach, and progressively reduce it as the neuromuscular system develops the ability to manage movement independently. Each session exposes the hips, knees, and ankles to the positional range of motion that has been denied them. Each transition from the floor to a standing position trains the strength, balance, and coordination that the mortality test measures. Scores on the sit-to-stand test improve with practice. Araujo's own subsequent work documented that participants who began practicing transitions from the floor showed measurable improvements in their composite scores over months. The test is not a fixed measure of biological age. It is a measure of current capacity, ability that responds to the stimulus of the movement it measures. And consider what this means practically. A person who scores 4 out of 10 on the sit-to-stand test, needing both hands and one knee to stand up from the floor, is in the highest risk category for mortality. If that person begins practicing transitions from the floor to a standing position with progressively reduced support, their score could improve to 6, 7, 8 over the months. Each point of improvement is associated with a 21% reduction in mortality risk. The improvement is not cosmetic. It reflects genuine gains in hip extensor strength through range of motion, proprioceptive integration under load, ankle dorsiflexion, and cerebellar balance computation. The 4 systems whose combined degradation the mortality data were measuring. The test doesn't just predict, it prescribes. The movement it scores is the movement that reverses the score. No other predictor of mortality has this property. Blood pressure predicts mortality, but measuring blood pressure doesn't reduce it. Body mass index predicts mortality, but stepping on a scale doesn't reduce it. The sit-to-stand test predicts mortality, and performing the movement the test measures reduces the risk of mortality. Testing and training are the same action. Measurement is the remedy. This equivalence, the test that predicts death being identical to the exercise that postpones it, surprised me when I first saw it in the data, because it means that the floor is not merely the place where the test takes place. It is the environment whose absence the test has always measured. Okinawa, Sardinia, Ikaria, Nicoya, Loma Linda. 5 populations, 5 geographies, 5 different diets, 5 different climates, 5 different genetic histories. One shared detail that no one in longevity research has adequately explained: the absence of the chair. Centenarians in these populations did not participate in exercise programs. They did not undergo physical therapy. They did not attend classes or follow protocols. They sat on the floor and stood up from it dozens of times a day throughout their lives. Each transition trained the strength, flexibility, balance, and motor coordination that the sit-to-stand test measures and that mortality data are said to predict how long a person lives. Your hip joints received loading on every articular surface every day throughout the full range of motion of sitting positions on the floor. Your cartilage was nourished by imbibition throughout the joint, not deprived on the surfaces neglected by the chair. Your iliopsoas never shortened to the length of the chair because it was never held at chair length for 8 hours straight. Your gluteus maximus was activated through full range dozens of times a day because lifting from the floor demands it. Your proprioceptive systems were challenged by the balanced transition of each movement from the floor to the standing position. Your motor cortex maintained the neural patterns for deep squats and transitions from the floor because those patterns were used every day and never pruned. The floor was never a cultural peculiarity. It was an environment of movement that maintained the systems the body cannot afford to lose. The chair removed that environment. The body adapted to the chair. The sit-to-stand test measures the cost of that adaptation, and the ground is still there.